Good evening and welcome to another edition of Israel Update. I'm Charlie Bernhaut, and each week together with my co-host Helen Friedman, we bring you news out of Israel and quite frequently some very interesting guests. Helen is in Israel at the moment, and so I'm going to be doing this show solo. I'm very pleased to have with us in the studio this evening an old friend, Chaim ben Pesach. Many of you are familiar with Chaim, but I have to tell you that there are very few people who I admire and respect, people who stand up for their principles and their beliefs. And I must tell you right off the start that Chaim is one of the few people who I've met in my lifetime who has very, very strong beliefs, but he puts his money where his mouth is, and I find that to be very rare. We have a lot of things that we're going to be discussing this evening. You know that these 30 minutes go by very quickly. We're going to try to get as much in as possible. Good evening, Chaim.
Good evening, Charlie.
For our viewers who are not familiar with your background, perhaps let's start off with a little bit about you.
Well, I was the national chairman of the Jewish Defense League, and we led a campaign to free Soviet Jews, a campaign which I believe led to the freedom of over 1 million Soviet Jews. In fact, even left-wing Jewish establishment organizations that condemned us admitted that it was our campaign that led to that. B'nai B'rith, for instance, has a magazine called the International Jewish Monthly. In their April 1985 edition, they said that the JDL was the organization that pushed them into action on the issue of Soviet Jewry. William Berkowitz, who was the head of the New York Board of Rabbis, who condemned the JDL in the most vigorous way, nevertheless admitted that all that he did and all the organizations that he was ever affiliated with, everything they did for Soviet Jewry was because of Rabbi Meir Kahana and the Jewish Defense League. As the head of the JDL, I got involved in activities that were designed to make sure the issue makes page one. And I was arrested, and I did go to prison. I spent 5.5 years in prison for the activities of the JDL to free Soviet Jews. And as a result, over 1 million Jews now live in Israel. It was a wonderful historic accomplishment. Today, we have a group called JTF.org, which is also a website that people can go to, where we're trying to alert America and Israel to the grave peril of Islamic terrorism that threatens the very survival of Western civilization. The very survival of everything we care about and cherish is on the line at this point. This is a terrible threat because the Islamic terrorists that destroyed the World Trade Center are preparing to attack this country with weapons of mass destruction. Nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons that are being worked on right now. Iran, for instance, which is a vicious terrorist country, is very close to developing nuclear weapons. The threat is very grave, and we must wake up the American people before it's too late.
And Iraq also, of course. You had prophecy, if I could call it that. In 1994, you predicted what was going to be happening here, and no one listened.
I wouldn't exactly call it prophecy, but whatever word you want to use, Rabbi Kahana has to get the credit here, really, because he was warning Americans since the 1960s that the terrorism that the Arabs are committing against Israel will inevitably spread to America, that the same hatred they have for Israel exists against the United States and the West. They despise the Christians as much as they despise the Jews. They despise the United States as much as they despise Israel. And Rabbi Kahana warned that the terrorism in Israel is not some isolated situation against a tiny country in the Middle East. This is an attempt to destroy Western civilization. In 1994, well, we can actually go back to the first bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993 by Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman and the other Arab terrorists. They were the ones who murdered Rabbi Kahana in 1990. Rabbi Kahana was assassinated at a hotel in New York in 1990. And the same people who did that ended up bombing the World Trade Center. We warned the FBI repeatedly after the murder of Rabbi Kahana in 1990. We warned them repeatedly that this was going to happen, that there were going to be terrorist attacks by these people. Nobody arrested these terrorists because of anti-Semitism.
Well, we also know that they found in Nosser's possession the outlines of the plans to blow up the World Trade Center, and it was totally ignored in 1990. They did nothing about Kahani's murder, and in a way that brought about the World Trade Center situation.
Absolutely. El Sayed Nosser was the trigger man in Rabbi Kahana's assassination. Sheikh Rahman, of course, was the terrorist ringleader operating out of a big mosque in Jersey City, New Jersey, and he, of course, had connections with Osama bin Laden, with Yasser Arafat, and with other international terrorists. El Sayed Nosser was arrested and caught red-handed murdering Rabbi Kahana. and they recovered from his apartment numerous volumes of papers in Arabic. They never translated those papers. And I met with John O'Neill, who was in charge of the investigation into Rabbi Kahana's murder.
He's from the FBI?
He was the head of the FBI's terrorist task force. He was in charge of all the big terrorist investigations. He ran all of their big investigations nationally and internationally. And I met with him in January 1993, 1 month before the first bombing of the World Trade Center, and I said they're going to bomb, I said they're going to attack targets in New York, major terrorist attacks are coming very quickly. He said, do you have any proof of this? I said to him, you already have the proof, just read Nasser's Arabic papers. They didn't do it, of course. And then in February of 1993, the World Trade Center was attacked the first time. 6 people were murdered, over 1,000 were injured, over $1 billion in damage. Then, after that, they decided to read Nasser's papers, and they found the plans to bomb the World Trade Center, the diagrams, the pictures, the plans to attack the Holland and Lincoln tunnels, the George Washington Bridge, and other targets.
Yes.
They found all this when it was already too late. Following that, in 1990, I had many meetings with O'Neill over the years, who is no longer with us. He left the FBI eventually to become the head of the World Trade Center security and was blown up and killed in the September 11th attack.
Really?
Yeah.
That's ironic, really.
Yeah.
Very ironic.
And we used to have a lot of arguments in the beginning. After a while, he began to see and began to agree with me more and more in what I was telling him about the Muslim world, about the Arab world, about what they were planning. He began to see it, and he began to fight against his superiors until he was pretty much forced out of his position, because he, as a matter of conscience, couldn't go along with this anymore. He realized that the American people were being set up for terrible attacks, because there's one thing that we can be sure of in the United States and in Israel. The people who run this country, whether it's the government or the media or the big corporations, the people who have real power, will do nothing to jeopardize our relationship with the Arab oil-producing countries, even if it means millions of Americans getting killed. They will not jeopardize our relationship with Saudi Arabia and those countries, no matter what. They know the Saudis financed the bombing of the World Trade Center on September 11th. They know the so-called Muslim charities in Riyadh were used to pay for it. They actually have a direct money trail.
Most of those involved were Saudis, and it came in with Saudi papers. It's hard to believe that we still continue to deal with the Saudis in the same way.
Not just deal with them, we're giving them hundreds of billions of dollars in oil money. We are financing our own destruction. That money is being used to build weapons of mass destruction, to murder millions of Americans. This is national suicide. We're cutting our own throats. We could easily become energy independent. But anyway, just getting back to this point of what we predicted.
Right.
In 1994, I did a show where many times I made these predictions over the years. You interviewed me on your fantastic radio show. You had such a great radio show. Boy, do I miss that radio show. That was a great radio show.
Thank you. I miss it, and I miss you on it also.
It was really great.
Thank you.
We had a great time.
Yes.
But I made predictions for many, many years, for decades. And in 1994, I started doing programs on public access, on MMN, on Queen's Cable, and I started saying, I know that the people who bombed the World Trade Center in 1993 are going to come back to finish the job. I knew something about the bombing business, because I had been in the business. Of course, I wouldn't hurt innocent people, and I was fighting for a just cause, freeing Soviet Jews.
Right.
So it wasn't like these barbarians who murdered thousands of innocent people. But I knew something about the MO. I knew that they're not going to settle. They wanted to bring down the Twin Towers, and they're not going to settle for just killing 6 people. Their intention originally was to bring down the Twin Towers. They viewed the first bombing as a failure. And I knew they were going to come back, and they weren't going to be happy until they brought down the Twin Towers and killed thousands of people.
Yeah, I think that's a point that gets lost in history, so to speak, that it was their intent to topple the building and to kill tens of thousands at the time. And had they toppled it into the other building, God knows how many people would have died.